The biggest problem that Vancouver as an entire city currently suffers from is their housing crisis. What I mean by this is the entirety of the lower class and the middle class suffer from an unavailability of housing. This is everyday working class families unable to put roofs over their head and thus unable to access things like shelter, basic needs, and other things that would increase their quality of life. As opening government today, the biggest problem that we see is the housing crisis, and the biggest solution that we see is public housing. And for this reason, we're so proud to propose. I'm going to do a couple of things this week. I firstly want to start out by characterizing to you what this motion even looks like, and then bring forward 2 points. Firstly, on why the government is morally obligated to pursue this as a solution, and the second of which just talks more generally about the housing problem. But firstly then, let's model and define this debate a little bit. As Vancouvers, this is an actor motion. We think that all arguments must be relevant to the individual incentives and goals of Vancouver as a city. So that is probably to say what best benefits the citizens of Vancouver most. And I think this is issues like their quality of life in the status quo, massive economic inequalities, and most importantly, housing. Secondly then, what does private development versus public housing look like? And I think public housing is pretty simple. It's affordable housing created or contracted by the government to build, where people can easily access it. However, in the opposition world, the world they have to defend is where private companies buy land and then they can build their own buildings over it, sell it for any price that they like, which would probably be at market price or even higher. Finally then, let's move on to our 2 arguments. First of which, I want to talk about why the government has a moral obligation to pursue this as a policy plan. And I really think this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's about state failure, and second, it's about protecting its most vulnerable populations. But firstly, what do I mean by state failure? I think that the only reason the housing crisis exists, or negative quality of life exists in the status quo, is because of decades of bad policies enacted by the government. It's because they fundamentally neglected their need to protect the most vulnerable in their society. That's why we're at this point in time. The first example of this is Indigenous people. And I think the most obvious and most concrete example of this is also Indigenous people, because you can obviously see the government in the status quo has deprioritized their treaties and communication with them. In those previous societies, there was no such thing as like unaffordable housing or poverty or even unemployment. And I think in those old societies, there were previously like a lot of better policies, etc. The second thing is, I think there were also just bad economic policies in wider society. So I think this looks like decades of like allowing people to come in here and raise the market prices so that normal, everyday, working class families can't afford them. But the second thing I do want to talk about on this argument is about the most vulnerable populations that the government has been ignoring for decades. Simply put, allowing private development uniquely de-incentivizes the government from caring about these lower and middle class populations who suffer and are excluded from the unique benefits the system is able to give. Therefore, the government has a moral obligation to change these systems, to integrate the values that we care about, such as things like freedom and such as things like economic prosperity. Finally then, I think the government has also allowed decades of intergenerational poverty to exist to the point that individual citizens don't have what they need to pursue life and a basic quality of life, such as things like shelter. At the end of this, what does all of this mean? I think the only rational solution for this is public housing for a couple of reasons. I think firstly then, private development does not fulfill these governmental obligations at all. What, simply put, private development is able to do is perhaps stimulate the housing sector. But in a city like Vancouver, we definitely don't need that. The government has the direct obligation to subsidize this housing to directly make it more accessible to these citizens. If they don't, they principally fail their obligation as a government and must be held morally irresponsible. Secondly then, I do want to talk about the general housing problem. And I think I observed 2 large problems with this in society in the first place. Firstly, I do want to talk about the price that the houses are put at, which makes it inaccessible to the vast majority of populations. And secondly, I want to talk about the types of houses or the types of supply that is being built. But firstly then, the biggest problem with the housing market is obviously the price. As you can see, I think the median price for a just general house that would fit like maybe 4 people is above $2 million. That's an absolutely ridiculous amount for a general working class population right out of college to be able to afford. This skyrocketing price is often driven by private investment itself and decades of immigration that have just messed up the market, and things like overpopulation that also drive up the demand for it. But the second problem that I see in status quo is probably things like supply. So I think, what do I mean by this? In the status quo, private development is often catered to those who are able to offer the company the most profit. So simply put, because there's an overwhelming population of millionaires in Vancouver and rich people who are willing to spend that much on mansions in the suburbs, that means that private development has the incentive to cater to these rich people who they know are going to buy up their houses. When they take this land and when they construct on this land, they don't do it in favor of like the lower class or the middle class. Who they cater to is really the people padding their pockets with more money. What this means is just the profit incentive leads to more and more suburbs being built, the government protecting more and more mansions, rather than actually building affordable housing that a middle class family could use to fit their shelter needs. Therefore then, I think you just see a general few impacts happen. Firstly then, you see a lot of massive poverty. And I think that's because the vast majority of Vancouver citizens have to spend most of their time worrying about whether or not they're going to actually get a roof over their heads, to the point that home ownership is actually something far, far in the future and not something they can look forward to as a guaranteed thing. But the second impact is the middle class is just excluded from all of these policies. So even those people that society deems to be well off enough can't even actually access the housing that was promised to them. And I think for that reason, public housing is the only rational way that we need to solve this, because we create specific catered housing which is less expensive for the vast majority of populations. For that reason, I'm so proud to propose.
Because we care about an actual solution to the huge housing crisis we face in Vancouver, we are so proud to negate today the motion this House as Vancouver would prioritize public housing over private development. Judge, I will be doing a couple of things for you today. Firstly, I will be providing a two-world comparison, identifying the most important problem and the solvency to that, which is only through private companies. And lastly, my 2 points and refutation at the end if I have time. So starting with the two-world comparison, what does the world actually look like when the motion is implemented? On proposition, we have the Public Housing Department, which is going to be run by the government, obviously, because they're going to be the ones who fund and operate these systems. Because public means like controlled for the public, which means it is controlled by the government. However, this means that they will prioritize and focus all their attention onto this. So because that the government's resources are really limited in the status quo and they can only focus on a certain amount of things, this means that private sectors and development will be very declining. And governments will be able to freely control the housing market because of this lack of competition from other private sectors. On opposition side of the world, we have not prioritizing public, which means that private companies are free to get better and compete with each other, which provides the best benefits for the buyers themselves. And the housing market industry is still kept as a free industry because of supply and demand, which will drive the private sectors and allow them to provide the best for the actual buyers. So the main problem, again, is the housing crisis because of so many people living in poverty or suffering from a lack of homelessness and who can't even provide a roof above their heads for themselves and their family. This is caused even worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the only solvency for this is through private sectors, because first of all, they are accountable. They can keep themselves accountable. The private sectors can keep themselves accountable, but they cannot keep the governments accountable. No one can keep the government accountable because they're like the biggest part. Sure, there can be elections, but that only happens once in a while, and still, no matter what, the private sectors have way more like accountabilities and can keep themselves in check. So the government can't do this because also they have other priorities, and this is bad because we need to be focusing all our attention on this, which is only achievable through private sectors, because that's our whole job, to focus on this in this highly competitive field. And because of supply and demand will provide the best for buyers themselves, this is the best possible solution. Okay, on to my contention 1, which is that private development solves. There are many issues in the status quo with the housing market because of the government. 2 reasons for this. Firstly is corruption. Often understand that public means that government, we have already talked about this. However, public and government sectors are often corrupt in the housing industry. One example of this is in the US, where we see that government-sponsored housing is the most corrupt because of the government's political schemes and etc. that divert their attention from their focusing on the real problem, which is providing houses for individuals. Not to mention, they have no accountability whatsoever because they lack essential checks and balances, which can only be happening through private sectors, which can keep themselves in check as well as keep their other competitors in check, which is completely impossible on the government side because the government is the most powerful group in a country and they can only, they lack someone to keep them in check. This means that the government's political schemes often get in the way of the actual housing market and get in the way of like what actually benefits the buyers and the citizens the most, causing this to be a huge problem. However, the only possible way to prioritize these people and giving them a house is through the private sectors because they can keep themselves accountable and there is less competition. And competition drives innovation, which allows for better houses. Yeah?
If the government no longer, as you state, is not accountable for the public housing industry, then the solution will not be solved at the end of the day. Meaning the government's going to have to put even more money in to help solve the public housing crisis.
Okay, no, so we're saying that the government has no one to keep them in check. So like if they make a mistake or if they're doing something without considering the thoughts of citizens, which is extremely possible since we already proved the example of the US where the government sponsored housing was actually the most corrupt and worst housing. However, we see that this problem is not existing with private sectors because they can keep themselves in check as well as keep their competitors in check. Okay, continuing on, competition also leads to innovation, like I said before, which leads to better perks in this industry. And also, again, the keeping in check makes them more reliable. And secondly, we talk about a government monopoly. If we prioritize public, this means that all their attention and focus will be diverted into these public housing companies, which means that there will be a clear decline in private companies because they can't even compete likely. So a likely outcome will mean the government will be the only source of housing. However, everyone relying on governmental housing is really bad. Firstly, empirically, as communal housing was really bad in the status quo, like we have past evidence such as the US example, not to mention government schemes and politics often get in the way of this and shifts to a less good scenario. And secondly, government has control over everything. This means the entire housing industry. This means they could raise prices however they like. If they have the sole power over this because there's a lack of competition. So this just makes the housing crisis even worse. However, private companies solve this because they're ever changing because of the competition drives them to create new innovation and better solutions to this, which means that private is the best and only scenario. On this basis, we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
This debate comes down to the matter of priorities. What should we be prioritizing in terms of the housing crisis, in terms of the economy, and in terms of our people, and for Vancouver as a whole? Both sides right now have recognized the housing crisis, and and both sides have recognized the matter of the housing crisis and how people are failing to be able to put a roof on their own heads. But the main problem is that the private companies, the private developing companies, they strive for profit. They strive to be able to get money and to be able to better themselves that way, instead of actually caring about the matter, about what actually matters, which is the people and our society. Right? So when even renting a simple apartment, renting a house becomes an issue, much less buying homes is not something that we should be considering or something that we can be considering as a general citizen. But this is a simple matter of like prosperity and stuff. When you're not even giving the people of your world a chance to get housing, due to problems such as pricing and demand, there is in no way that you're solving the actual issue, but these are only things that that prioritizing public housing would be able to help us solve. So in our speech, I'll be going through some rebuttals and then moving on to one main link about the economy and doing some weighing at the end. Now, they gave us a few main points on in their speech on how, mainly on how the government cannot, there's no one to hold them accountable, and that private companies are able to keep themselves and their competitors in check. But once again, the main issue is that they are profit-based, and SideCon is lacking to see that right now. They will be investing so much into larger cooperations and larger issues and larger terms of housing, mansions and stuff, because they want to be able to gain the most profit out of that piece of land instead of caring about the people, which is what we should be thinking about due to how severe the actual problem is in the current status quo. They talk about corruption as well, and But a few points for you. Number one, this is mainly about Vancouver as this house has been framed. And that is not happening tangibly in Vancouver right now. So this is not a main issue that we should be thinking about. But B, then they talk about how the competition keeps them in check, but we clearly do not see the effects of that right now because they are so focused on catering to the richest of the richest possible because they want to be able to gain money back. We still see like incredibly high prices for unlivable conditions and for something that's so basic, and that's supposed to be a basic human right. And number three, let's say like you buy all of their points. That still doesn't take away the fact that there are elections and protests that keep them in check and make sure that they are catering somewhat to the people's needs for as the government.
POI.
So, yes.
No matter what, it's way easier for private companies to keep themselves in check, whereas to conduct a whole nother election, which takes time, money, and resources.
We're not claiming that we should be conducting a whole other election, but we're simply claiming that this is one of the many things that can keep the government in check, and they won't just simply put all of their money into something that doesn't matter. But we're claiming in this, when you prioritize public development, when you prioritize public housing, that the government will be doing what matters the most for the people and for the Vancouver as a whole. Okay, moving on to my link on economy, right? So the reality is the private development statement happens on either side of the house. But it's just that on our side, we also prioritize public development. So what are the impacts of this? When homeless people are when the amount of homeless people are just rising incredibly, and you aren't doing anything about it and not doing anything productive with it, you're simply wasting your time, your money, and your effort. When the people are struggling to put a roof over their houses, they can't even go find a job or to help quote unquote contribute to the society and help with the economy, which is how it also hinders economic development when you do not prioritize the main problem of the housing crisis. It is a basic human right to be able to live, to be able to have a roof over their heads, and to be able to live fearlessly on not wondering where they should go that night, and not wondering about the cold and whether they even have enough food to eat. However, the simple matter is that the people are what makes up the economy, and when the people are struggling, the economy won't prosper either. You need to solve you have to solve the people's problem first. You have to help the people to be able to get to the place that they need to in order for the economy to see any actual tangible benefits of it. Right? We need to be able to cater and worry about things that actually matter. When people have a roof over their head, when people have less worries, when people are able to actually live the lives that they are living, the productivity of the entire society it would increase, and the things they do that would benefit the society, that would benefit other people around them would also increase. Such an example would be how they, instead of having to put 80% of their income into rent, or put 89% of their income into rent, and having to worry about like other stuff while working 3 part-time jobs every day just to basically survive, they can actually think about things that matter, such as connections. They can make things, they can contribute to the society, they can help with charities, they can help with other things that would actually help us improve as a whole, economically, socially, and in other aspects as well. Lastly, I'll be just moving on to some way. What actually matters in this debate is the people and for the economy, which is what the whole debate covers. We need to be able to prioritize the things that matter. We prioritize having people that are actually able to live, that are able to function in society and to be able to have a roof over their heads. We want people to be able to live their lives, and we want to get rid of the initial problem of the housing crisis, which has been here for decades and decades that we still have yet to solve. And public housing is the way to do it, because people are able to actually put people are actually able to put time and effort into other things, such as the people that matter. And hence that is why I'm so proud to propose on OT. Thank you.
There is a pre-existent reason why housing has been such a crisis to the point we have to debate this issue in the status quo compared to other similar cities with similar economic and government structures. You have to question, Judge, why, if we have such a similar structure of economy and government, why do we have the worst of the stick? Why are we getting the bad impacts while other cities don't have such a huge crisis like us? We're on-site opposition would like to point our fingers to the government. As a second speaker on side opposition, I'll first give you some reconstruction on some refutation done by the government team. Then I'll move on to another argument. Lastly, deliver some refutation and weighing at the end of halftime. Starting on some reconstruction, they really wanted to talk about the innovation point that my partner Alina extended. They say that the private sector is rather profit-based, and however, we would say that one, the competition would really check that, and check and balances would cause no issues to exist within a private sector. Then two, we would say that the whole reason why the market is horrible right now is because the government messed it up, like their C1 about the government morals said. Realize that in their whole first contention, they list their own mistakes from the past. Why would you trust the government to do again what they've messed up in the past so many times? We would say that too, the status quo only helps us on the opposition, as currently the competition is working and checking. Yes, I'll take it away.
Clearly you haven't listened to our first argument because we told you exactly how in the past the government has prioritized private development as well as bad economic policies rather than the actual people that are being affected by the housing crisis by using public housing. Please engage that.
Okay, sure. We would say that one, public housing was a huge thing in the past decades. They were completely focused on that as well, and you can't just stand up and say they never focused on that and only focused on private sector. And then two, we would rather say that it makes more sense that it's just the government actors, even if they would say that, even if they do public housing, they're likely going to mess it up again no matter what. Let's go into our second argument. The third argument that we like to bring to you today is called bringing in the values. We would say that 99% of the nonprofit sector is non-government owned, which qualifies it as a private company or the private sector as well. We say that counting the private sector as nonprofit, there's no reason why we should include the private sector in this debate, as they're one of the huge actors in the housing market in the status quo. Within the status quo is that the government lacks accountability and a vision to include everyone's opinion, which leads to the extension of my partner's statistics tells you over 35% of the homeless population is indigenous people. We see that under the gov's leadership, the prosperity only benefits the wealthy few. Corruption and political favors ruins the housing market. Again, the example from the US about the Section 8 housing directly gives you this real-life example. We on side opposition would argue the only way to start this change and turn this around is to conduct and bring in the nonprofit sector into this round on the housing issue. The value that the nonprofit sector brings into housing allows the prioritization of humanity being a factor within housing development. We will argue that people who offers their lives to contribute to the benefit of others in the nonprofit sector not only have strong morals and a sense of responsibility more than the side opposition has, that it also allows them for more accountability, but also leads to development made for others in mind, not themselves or the profit. We would also say by bringing in the nonprofits, we would take profits out of the equation, which leads to lower housing costs for all every time the nonprofit sector sponsors or builds and contracts a house. We would say if the government takes control the housing market, it will be really hard for the nonprofits to check the government, and it will be unlikely for the government to check themselves as well as group this response to the election point they talked about. Let's get back to the reconstruction about the election point they said. We say it's really unlikely election can check any way of government action, as one, it's likely going to be political games. The government's going to solve a really basic layer of issue, or maybe solve like a streets housing problem, and then say they've solved housing problems for the next 5 years, as that's what governments have been doing for the past decades. They say they solve all of the issue, while in fact they solve just a little bit of it and exaggerate it so they get voters. Then they're going to move on to solve other issues after that. And second, we say that election doesn't matter because in the status quo in the US, there's still corruption in the housing or other bad things the government does, but election does nothing to cancel that for the past years. So we say election does nothing to provide checks and balances. Only bringing in the nonprofit that oversees the private sector can only lead to the benefits set by us. Let's go on to some rebuttal on their side. First, on the government morals, we would say that the current crisis exists is only because of the government reasons. We would say that this is why exactly we should not give such responsibility and power to the government again, as they likely have no care for the minorities, and the voters are won by the majority. They only want to benefit the majority rather than the minority that's usually not included in the conversations that governments are having. So there's no reason you should give this power to the government again. Then we would say that the government, we would say that it's not a good reason to just let the government do it because like we say they did it, so they have the moral reason to solve. We should say it should be whoever solves it the best, solves the issues in the status quo. Lastly, they say that rich they like to price sector benefits the rich. We say that the rich is only 1% of the population. Even there's like 1 or 2 contractors that only built mansions. Everyone else was still really focused on the other people. Then lastly, we say even if there's demand in the market, there will always be companies to solve. So even if there's always a housing demand, there is going to be companies to come and build house for them. Lastly, because they're driven by profits, governments can completely subsidize these corporations to build houses for the homeless, which also links back to their point. Lastly, that's why we're so proud to stand outside opposition. I lost like 10 seconds there just because that fell down.
The most important thing that is missed throughout this entire debate is the long-term stability for both industries, housing, private development, and in general for low and middle income classes. And thus, I stand in closing proposition in today's motion. This House of Vancouver would prioritize public housing over private development. And so a quick roadmap in my speech, I will first be providing a burden, refuting opposition's arguments, and then I will cover our contention on long-term stability. So first, the burden of team closing proposition in today's debate is to prove that we benefit the most people in the most sustainable way on a long-term basis. And so let's begin with some refutation to opening opposition. First, beginning with their case, they talk about how current housing is bad because of the government, and they kind of take this stance on how don't trust the government, they have messed up, they're super rah. And so basically, I think that, number one, my response is that I think we open our eyes further, and I think that opening opposition scope is really small, because at the end of the day, we should be prioritizing the long-term stability of recovering over the housing issue, and that this debate isn't necessarily about the bickering around and how the government absolutely sucks, and not necessarily about that. And they also specifically on how current housing is bad because of the government, we would say that no, it's because of inflation, which is what we will extend on you for today. Next, they talk about how their third argument, bringing in values, how people in private development has strong morals and nonprofits, and how this leads to lower housing costs. And number one, I think that this argument claims impacts that doesn't have a clear link and connection to how it would occur. So overall, I just don't really know how to respond into this, because I don't think that it would lead to lower housing costs, as they don't explain it very well. And now, lastly, moving on to their case, they say that government has no incentive. No, thank you. Government has no incentive to help minority, and that don't give the government power. And number one, I think that prioritizing housing would help the minority, and also that prioritizing housing doesn't mean that the government is just going to have all this power and dictatorship, because it's a prioritizing motion. So now specifically onto our arguments. So beginning with our argument, we would say that prioritizing public housing is best, only, and most immediate solution to the current economic crisis in order for long-term stability and pretty much for solvency, which is what our extension will be. So number one, talking about how the housing, we would say that housing is pretty much the biggest equity that anyone can have, because ultimately it's property, it's land, that's pretty much incredibly valuable. And so I would also argue that housing is the root cause of many human rights and necessities, proper food through refrigeration, shelter, etc. And we would also say that public housing is equivalent to affordable and accessible housing. Rejection to the rising and ridiculous costs of housing and affordable housing would is leading to more people having access against the crisis inflation of housing. And so this is pretty much reiterating what opening government had said, but now let's extend and go in depth of what they didn't. So opening government says that housing is inaccessible, but doesn't necessarily explain why not. And so the reason is inflation, which is what we would argue, overbidding, and the idea of demand versus supply, but the biggest idea of inflation. And now what we would say is by putting a price cap on housing decreases inflation as a whole, but moreover, because housing is so big and the root cause of so many assets, we would say that inflation generally increases like crazy because of outbidding on homes. And so not only are we talking about the public housing aspect, but also that this would amplify onto the general inflation and, I suppose, economy. And so what's the impact of this? Number one, we would help and stabilize and provide stability for the housing crisis, but also specifically help those who are even not we would help those that are even not eligible for public housing necessarily, but also help them on a broader scale because of the way we impact impact inflation as a whole. And so leading on to that, number 2, lower inflation and interest rates on a general scale. And number 3, meaning higher quality of life for middle and lower classes. I'll take that in a moment, becoming more affordable. And lastly, number 4, we link into private development because without prioritizing public housing, the crisis will continue to destroy and hurt even smaller and private corporations with inflation. I'll take that, Pilar.
So won't have reducing competition and having the government be solely in control of the housing market only worsen inflation?
I have 2 responses to that. Number 1, this kind of links into what I was saying earlier in refutation, but I think that opening opposition kind of misses the idea of the motion and how we're prioritizing it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the government would just go hands down, have control of everything, superpower. But also, I would also say that secondly, that is untrue, because we would say that when we provide more affordable and accessible housing, that would lead to lower inflation because we are putting a cap on it and reducing the, I suppose, offering more affordability. And so now let's just do some comparative analysis at the end. Specifically on government's world, housing is the largest issue we should prioritize because specifically in Vancouver, there's ultimately nowhere else to go. On this side, we have the US border. On the north, and I guess that way, we would have mountains, and the other side is water. So this shows how this shows how there's ultimately no other way with housing and how it's unique. And so we would say that's unique to public housing and not private development because number 1, private development isn't restricted within an area, but also number 2, on an individual level. So specifically with private development, it's with public housing, it's incredibly more difficult as on an individual level, you have to change, if there's not enough houses, you would have to change jobs, you would change schools to commit to housing elsewhere. So we would say that this idea of how specifically in Vancouver, there's nowhere else to go is specific to the public housing market. And so now on opposition's world, we would say that the reality on opposition's world is that the housing crisis cannot be solved and will continue to thrive. We would say that private developments will still exist and ultimately be unaffected even if we don't prioritize. However, we would also say that it would be the private developments would be benefited even more when prioritizing public housing. So when we really weigh it on a scale, we would say that on opposition's world, the public housing market crisis will continue to thrive. However, the public-private developments doesn't necessarily get this overarching benefit that outweighs in some way. However, in government's world, it's such a significant difference as we were able to take a stance against this crisis, but also benefit the private developments in some way or another, as I've explained, and thus we are so proud to propose.
What opposition will bring to you in today's debate is a unique extension on essentially why quality over quantity is also a very important point within this debate. I think that if people who are poor, and they suddenly get a house, I think they would most likely probably prefer a house with electricity and thicker walls over a house with a broken roof. Because of this reasoning, we're so proud to oppose this motion. I'll be going into a bit more depth, so first of all, I'll be going into kind of some framing, and then I'll go over refuting the other side's arguments, and then I'll go over our extension. So first of all, let's start off with some framing. So actually, we think that since if privatization actually works well, we think that governments are likely to actually encourage them because we've already seen that currently the problem with a lot of the housing crisis is because of the government, because the government actually like they said deals with the inflation rates. And also they don't talk that specifically about inflation rates, so I'll expand on that a little bit more. Inflation is a result of supply, demand, and adjustion of central bank's interest rates, and so there's a lot more factors that come into what affects inflation. So closing government's extension, although it kind of talks about how this public housing is going to decrease inflation and help people, inflation also needs to be adjusted so that the economy doesn't run off too far, because then it's going to have a crazy amount of recession and it has negative drawbacks because this economy is a self-correcting place. So that's essentially the gist of our refutation to CEG's extension. And so now is that a yeah, okay, I'll take that POI.
So you say you kind of compare with the worst of inflation, but we don't necessarily have to argue that it's going to solve inflation necessarily, but it would be way better on public housing and way worse for private development. So how would you, as private development, or advocating for private development, be better for in tackling inflation?
Okay, so essentially, like, the reason why private development, like, essentially what I'm pointing out is not essentially that, like, about which one, like, specifically, like, causes, like, private or public housing to be better, but I'm more so arguing that inflation is not just because of, like, when you, like, put a bunch of, like, more responsibility on the public government to make more public housing. I think that this responsibility in inflation also relies on the other factors that I've discussed. So because of this, since I've kind of refuted CG's extension, I think now is probably a good time to go over our own extension. So let's see. So here's our argument. Essentially, I have three key aspects of which this argument kind of works. So first of all, let's talk about private companies, right? So this is essentially like a bit of a reiteration. The difference is going to be the focus on quality over quantity. So firstly, private companies, as we discussed earlier, they have a profit incentive and they innovate cool stuff. So as example, we talked about in Europe, there's like the passive housing where essentially the walls of, like, when it's winter, it will be a bit more warm, and when it's summer, it will be a bit more cool. So then you can save your bills on, like, certain types of these things. So overall, it might cost a bit more in the short term, but overall in the long term, we think that this is a pretty big saving that you can make. Pretty good technology that you can access. And also, as we discussed earlier, there's an accountability in the laws and regulations because private companies obviously don't want to get sued, but also if they do badly, then they're also going to lose market share, which also private companies do not want to. So lower houses, so essentially, this comes down to, like, quality over quantity, because on private corporations we provide more high quality houses because they compete, and then we essentially just give more technology that is better for this house. We give more technology that is better for this for the goods of, like, the people that need this housing. Because despite all the action on, like, public housing, we think that also millions of people are suffering from inadequate housing. This is the more unique part. So what does this mean? Houses don't have enough working stoves, electricity, or water. It's not maintained as well. No, thank you. We create higher quality houses so that we can also solve this problem of not just homelessness, so that we can also solve the problem of not having adequate houses for the people that are in need of it. So on this basis, this is essentially the unique part of our extension, that we really hammer in the point that quality over quantity is very important with the houses that we give people. And also, we think that the government is likely to understand that private corporations are better in innovation, and the issue is that the government is also not fulfilling their burden. So if we see that private corporations are doing really well in providing the necessary technology and innovation that is needed so that the homeless and the people with inadequate houses actually get better housing, we think that this is a great thing for us to have. And so, because of this, this is our extension. And I guess since I have some extra time, I'll go also into a bit of refutation. We see that in OG, we see that they talk about how there's ridiculous house prices, and also O kind of also already talked about how they also need to focus a lot of their market share on the things that really matter, so like the middle income houses, and also essentially the gist is that our side creates higher quality houses that necessarily aren't created by the other sides of this debate. That's why we're so proud to oppose this motion.
This entire debate has boiled down to two main factors: whether or not the government is fundamentally required to sustain these homeless people, which they are, and also whether or not this will, at the end of the day, benefit the people as a whole. So going on quickly into, today I will elaborate on doing a case-by-case analysis of this debate, highlighting specifically how we should win. First, I would like to point out some crucial flaws in this debate, explain how we solve them, refute side opposition's final arguments as well as rebuild, and then finally do a case-by-case analysis. So quickly on to some actors. We see, as throughout the entire debate, that we have identified the main actors to be the vulnerable people, specifically the and continuous Indigenous communities that are consistently brought up. However, only on our side of the bench, on closing government, we have seen a proper, adequate solution to solve these kinds of things. Because we see exactly how inflation causes these housing to continue to raise, and at the end of the day, how prioritizing public housing over private development will truly improve the housing crisis that we currently see. All paints a very specific and niche world where the government covers everything. However, this is not plausible. Again, as my partner stated, we are specifically focused on prioritizing. That's just not the way it works. Because it is very possible for governments instead to focus specifically on partnering with private developing countries, developing companies, specifically by giving public housing to even just a portion of the homes, so on and so forth. The government still needs to partner with private developing in a way to be able to build homes at the end of the day, because there simply might not be enough companies to build public housing. In the status quo, we see that housing currently hikes due to inflation. And this inflation occurs since, as also with a direct refutation to side closing opposition final point about quality over quantity, we see the housing hikes due to inflation. Inflation occurs, as my partner has spoken, when there is a continuous increase in overbidding of these kinds of housing. As my partner had stated, Vancouver is surrounded by restrictions that keep Vancouver in its place, making housing in such high demand that we see currently in Vancouver. This is what hikes up these prices, because these prices continue to hike up, and if private developers are continuously prioritized as they are currently status quo, that means, no thank you, that means that these houses are continuing to go up, and the pricing continues to go up as we currently see in the status quo. Private developers want to get the most money for the amount that they had put into these houses, meaning that they're continuously going to take the highest bid. We always see the highest bid as this 1%, or even the 1% over across the sea, as they continue to buy homes that maybe they are not possibly living, continuing to hike inflation for the middle class and low class that we see here in Vancouver. And how does this directly refute with side closing opposition's point about quality over quantity? Since private developers want to make the most money from the houses that they've built, this also means that they are not taking always the best quality. We see a lot of these homes in Vancouver that private development is currently going on because inflation is raising prices all over the world. Quality over quantity does not always exist, and there's no way to prove that in the first place. The government is always going to be held accountable to keeping these high quality homes, in the sense that they, at the end of the day, are going to have to pay for reparations if these homes are not up to the quality that they should be. And there's a certain quality that must be met for these houses to be affordable for everyone. I will take it away.
So, what would you say in your world the government will actually be accountable for building good houses? If, like, in our speech we told you that all the past ways, like elections, of holding government accountable isn't really going to solve the issue.
Elections are not always the most immediate solution, but they are a solution. However, as I stated in my POI earlier, if the government is not putting the adequate support into these affordable, into these public housing, at the end of the day, the government is going to have to put even more money into fixing these kinds of things, because they're not helping anyone at the end of the day. And by not helping anyone at the end of the day, things are not becoming more affordable. The government is simply not doing the job. And as the front half of the bench has stated, the government has a priority to build these houses. If no one has any human rights, if no one has any houses, as there is no point in them succeeding or in the economy growing in the first place. Now, quickly going over to some differentiation from the front half. The front half talks about specifically about state failure and how does it obligation of the government. However, they fail to see the fact that on our side, we have mentioned how we affect the most amount of people. The government wants to affect the most amount of people. And the links that continue to say that. We provide the most sustainable solutions, as we state how this will fix the housing crisis at the end of the day, so the government does not have to be so involved at the end of the day. We also state how inflation will go down and everything else will become more affordable. And we also say how we benefit the low class as well as the middle class by making private developer cheaper as inflation rates continue to go down, since we're creating a price cap on public housing. There is no part for overbidding to exist, thus it will not exist. And also, a big point that they bring up is about private developers and how private developers are inside opposition, how private developers have this sort of competition between one another. However, this simply does not exist, because if private developers in this motion are not able to, if private developers are not able to, again, there's sort of a sense of competition, but at the end of the day, they're always working towards getting the most money, and that is simply not the solution that we're looking for. The solution we're looking for is, even if in the current time stasis, then houses should be affordable for the terms time, and how we are going to solve this over time as a whole point. Now, quickly going on to some, I have to have a direct refutation, and quickly going on to their whole point that all continues to bring up about the government, how they messed up in the first place. Well, we cannot simply just remove the government. At the end of the day, if private developers continue to, if we get rid of the government as a whole, and private developers become the main source of information, of building and housing, and something that is so crucially important that we're able to access all quality of life, then what makes private developers not say that they don't have to follow certain legislatures that the government does, and who's to say that they're not going to just continue to become even more corrupt? If the government messed up, we cannot just simply remove them, because at the end of the day, we're going to have even more impacts. And for all the reasons that we have stated, and for the amount of impacts that we see between all the different sides, how we are on impact, solvency, and how we solve the housing crisis at the end of the day with a short-term solution. For all those reasons, vote for second closing proposition.
For decades, private corporations have had significant innovation. For example, thicker walls for the winter, while the government provides inadequate housing and low-quality resources with the corrupt sector to provide this. As a whip speaker representing the closing opposition side, I'll be doing two things. First of all, provide some refutations against the other side's main arguments, but then secondly, provide three themes in this debate, representing the three other teams our side will be clashing against in this debate respectively. Okay, moving on to some refutations. First of all, what does the opening proposition side tell you? The opening proposition side tells you that the government has a burden and how it's to help the poor and homeless people. And they bring up state failure. Now, three responses. First of all, we don't see how the pricing is essentially the biggest issue, because this private development acknowledges that this demand is low, thus decreasing the price, right? Obviously, when they know that the people will not buy their houses because of the fact that it's overpriced, they will adjust, right? This is how these private corporations make this money, right? Thus decreasing the price. But secondly, having burden is not exclusive, right? Because private corporations also hold the burden to provide high quality products that directly benefit the people, and when they do benefit the people, this also benefits their profit incentive, right? Which obviously what is their end goal. So, but thirdly, no thank you, even when we do not prioritize public housing, the government will still maintain that burden, right? And the best way to fulfill that burden is to give the hand to these private corporations to give these high quality housing because of the fact that they specialize in innovation and profit incentive to generate their money, right? So, but moving on, no thank you. What does the closing government tell you? The closing government tells you about inflation, right? And how inflation is a really big issue, and how their side is better than the other side. Right? But two responses. First of all, we see that we must understand that the people will not buy these homes that are extremely expensive because of the fact that they simply cannot afford it. Private corporations have profit incentive, yes, but no one is even in their right mind going to buy these extremely expensive houses, and this is why these private companies are able to adjust the prices, obviously, to fix their prices, right? But secondly, even if it was true, it's not exclusive, right? Inflation happens either way, because they even admit that they don't even fully tackle inflation in the most, right? So obviously, that's not exclusive to their side either. But moving on to some themes. First of all, to my three themes. First of all, what does opening government tell you? The main case in opening government is that the government essentially has a burden, and they have to prove they have to essentially help the people, right? But this has already been refuted numerous times. But moving on, what do we tell you? We tell you about technology and innovation because of the fact that the people suffer from inadequate housing. This only exists on the opposite, which only helps on the opposition side, where we actually benefit inadequate housing. No, thank you. We, as closing opposition, make this comparison of having high quality houses that are directly linked to these private corporations because they have innovation, and comparing this to the government side when they have essentially houses giving away to everyone, except they fail to realize that the end goal is about these people to have high living conditions and good living conditions rather than a house that essentially has their roof blown away. I'll take your POI.
So why does quality matter when millions of low-income and middle-income people can't access them in the first place? And also, in turn, doesn't only high-class individuals get benefit from your quality?
Okay, responding to the POI, essentially the other side just essentially asserts that these higher income people or citizens will get the better benefits, except they fail to realize that even if this was true, if they were even still given the option to choose a really low quality house given by the government, which is extremely corrupted, this essentially makes no difference because the end result is that these people get good living conditions, right? But when we look on the government side, this does not happen because of the fact that the government fails to provide enough for these people, right? Because now moving on, we win in this theme against opening government because on magnitude because of the fact that a house with electricity and heat completely outweighs a house with a broken roof that cannot sustain these people, right? No, thank you. But no, moving on, what does opening opposition tell you? Opening opposition tells you about innovation, but they do not fail to explain. Like, even though we do take this idea into consideration, and we do believe this does play a major role in today's debate, we tell you about innovation and how we make the comparative that essentially having higher quality houses completely outweigh having houses that essentially don't provide the living qualities that these people deserve. But we are unique because of the fact that we make the comparison between these quality versus quantity, essentially. But moving on, we win in exclusivity because our side proves that this is better by going in depth. Our side essentially goes in depth with the quality over the homes that we can leech off of these average citizens, right? With just for them to suffer in freezing winter with no heat, right? So, but moving on, what does closing government tell you? Closing government tells you a point on inflation, but on inflation, right? But first of all, I've already refuted this, right? Now moving on, what do we tell you? We tell you about innovation and how we make this comparative. Essentially, like I've already stated time and time again, so I don't believe I need to restate this. But we win in this theme because of the fact that we win in inflation because inflation exists on both sides of the house, right? Because the closing government literally admits that essentially their point doesn't even tackle inflation to the fullest. But I'll be moving on and doing some weighing for today, telling why our side essentially is. Okay, what have I done for today? I've provided some refutations against the other side's points, and I've also provided 3 themes and explained why we wanted all 3, and this is why I'm so proud to stand for the government opposition side. This is why thank you.
Thank you so much.